Hello, fellow Lobsters. Welcome to the next episode of LOL, Love of Literature. And like the first season had finally come to an end so successfully, creating for us a great, very supportive author and publishing community. We're stepping into season two, and with season two, we have stepped up a lot more than the first season because we are bringing in authors from around the world. And one of them for us for you, for the listeners we've brought in today is Ms. Sarah Archer from the US. And I would request Ms. Stacy to give her formal introduction.
Sarah Archer's debut novel, The Plus One, was published by Putnam. As a screenwriter, she has been recognized by the Blacklist organization and the Nicholl Fellowship, and had material produced for Comedy Central. After working in TV and film development in Los Angeles, she currently lives in North Carolina. Welcome to LOL, Sarah. And so we hope you will have a good time talking today. So, yes. And first thing, I really want to share something with you. When I said Sarah Archer from North Carolina, a young author, is going to talk in LOL. My son asked, is she by any chance? Daughter or granddaughter of Jeffrey Archer? He asked me.
Not that I know of. Probably some kind of distant relation, but I've definitely gotten that question before.
Yeah. So now, Danya, you may want to start with the first question.
Yeah, fair enough. What happens usually is that people first start with writing novels or novellas, short stories, and then progress on to writing screen. But you've done it the exact, the other way around, the exact opposite of what people usually do, the conventional way. So how did this feel? Like, was it easier for you to, write for screens and then come down to writing novels? Or was it like, were they like two different ball games and you couldn't even compare each?
I guess I did kind of do it a little bit backwards. I studied screenwriting in college and moved out to LA right at the end of college to pursue screenwriting professionally. I was working in TV and film there. I don't know if it's necessarily easier or harder to do it in one order or the other. I think both screenwriting and writing fiction, there are certain skills that they kind of call on you to use. And so for any writer, I would always recommend, even if you have one area that you're really interested in, like try something else, branch out, try poetry if you've never written poetry, try writing a play, try screenwriting or fiction, or try a different genre than what you've normally done. I think you can always learn from that and apply different skills. I think in my case, since I did more screenwriting first and then kind of branched into fiction, one thing that screenwriting is really good about teaching you is structure. It's very, very focused on the structure and the story. And I think that's something that for a lot of writers doesn't come quite as naturally. We tend to get really excited about like the characters and the world and these sort of moments that we're building. And then you have to think about like, okay, well, wait, what are the mechanics of like this, where's the climax and how do the pieces kind of chain together and that sort of thing. And screenwriting really kind of forces you to think about that and be disciplined about it and put the structure first. So I learned that from an earlier time of my writing career, and I think that definitely helped me in writing fiction too and made that come a little bit more naturally. Screenwriting also really pushes you to be very efficient and really kind of condense everything down to its most important elements. And that's another thing that I think for a lot of fiction writers is tough. At least for me, like I always tend to write long and then I have to cut back. So screenwriting has really taught me how to do that. But on the other hand, I think that as I've gotten into fiction more, there are things that I've learned too that I can apply to my screenwriting and kind of different levels of character development that screenwriters don't necessarily focus on as much, and looking for ways to be a little bit more inventive and kind of surprise your reader. I think sometimes screenwriting, there can be a tendency to be sort of boilerplate and kind of writing by the numbers, and fiction writers tend to be a little bit more geared towards just being inventive and coming up with something that's totally original. And bringing that more into the screenwriting world, I think, is a helpful idea too. But it's definitely interesting to compare the two. And as I've gotten more into fiction, gotten to know more fiction writers and just seeing their process, it's so different a lot of times. Like, I don't know if you've heard the term pantsers versus plotters is something that writers talk about a lot. Like, do you plot everything out? Yeah, like do you outline, you know, your whole story before you write it, or do you just kind of jump in and write by the seat of your pants? And in screenwriting, everyone is a plotter. Like, you have to outline. That's just sort of accepted as a process. And so once I kind of got into the fiction world over the past several years and was meeting more novelists, to meet a lot of people who don't do that, who just kind of jump in and find the story as they go, at first was like kind of shocking for me because it was so different from how I was trained. But I think it's been helpful in some ways. Like, I'm still a plotter for sure. I think I'll always be someone who outlines and plans first. But I've learned to dial back a little bit on that and to kind of leave a little bit more room for creativity and finding things as you go along. And I think that's been really helpful too.
That said, you know, I thought I will ask about what this The Plus One is about. I understand it's a fiction, and tell me about what you did in the storytelling, because in your screenplay it is always scenes, scenes by scenes, right? Like you said, it's so structured. Yes, here you have the freedom of telling your story also, as well as showing your scenes, right? How did you balance one thing I want to ask? The other is, how was this book published? Traditionally, or did you publish yourself? And were there any rejections of your manuscript?
Yeah, so I guess with the first question about sort of how I wrote it, so it is a work of fiction. It's a romantic comedy, but it's got like some kind of sci-fi elements to it as well. So it's a little bit of a blended genre work, I guess you would say. And I, like you were saying, I definitely think in terms of scenes, and I don't know how much of that is just my screenwriting background versus maybe just kind of naturally how I write and envision things. I'm a very visual person, so maybe it comes from that. But I still, even when I'm writing fiction, I think in terms of scenes and I outline in terms of scenes, which I've noticed a lot of fiction writers don't do that. Like, they outline in terms of chapters. Whereas for me, I tend to, when I'm writing a first draft, I'll sort of, I don't really think about the chapters. I'll put chapter breaks in kind of where they feel natural as I'm going, but I don't pay that much attention to it. And then once I've got a whole first draft, one of the things I do is I go back and I look at where the chapter breaks are, and I think about like, okay, how long are these chapters? Are there any that seem really short or really long? Are there different places where I might want to break the chapters, that sort of thing? So that's kind of an after the fact addition for me. And when I'm first envisioning the story, I really do think more in terms of scenes. But it is interesting because obviously, like you were saying, in fiction, you don't necessarily have to write everything in scenes the way you do in screenwriting. You do have that liberty to just narrate and kind of tell the story, which still sometimes to me, as a screenwriter, feels a bit like cheating. Like, you're just telling the reader directly what's happening, which you can't do obviously when you're writing a screenplay. So it's nice to have that.
But in fiction, you tell your readers to also imagine, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you try to do it in a way where you're showing things rather than just telling them all the time, and you're kind of invoking that reader imagination and all of that. But yeah, I'm still very scene oriented when I'm writing, which I think in some ways helps with fiction too, because it helps you to make the story, kind of keep the story going along and keep focused on that sort of showing rather than telling. As far as your other question about how I got the book published, so it was traditionally published. I really went about it kind of the most traditional, old-fashioned way. I cold queried agents, sent out query letters, like I'm an agent, and then I did a round of revisions with her. And then once the book was ready, she sent it out to editors, and I signed with the publishing house, and then did basically, I think, 2 rounds of revisions with my editor, first to do kind of the bigger, more developmental changes, and then kind of smaller line by line, word level things. And then once that was done and the manuscript was kind of finalized and accepted. Then it was about a year, I think, from that point to when it was actually published. So during that time, obviously we did like a copy edit, making the cover, working on marketing, that sort of thing. So yeah, I did it kind of the traditional way.
So how long was this process? How long was this process alone after it was ready?
So, well, I guess from the beginning, when I wrote the novel, it took about 2 years, and I was working on other things off and on during that time. So it wasn't just writing that, but I took about 2 years to write it. Then I was querying agents for maybe 2 or 3 months or so, kind of doing it on a rolling basis, like
what is it about, Sarah? What is the novel about?
Well, so like I said, it's a romantic comedy.
Okay.
It takes place in Silicon Valley, and the main character is this young woman named Kelly, who's a robotics engineer. And she's very good at her work, but not so much doing well in her personal life. She's always single, and her mom's kind of always on her back about, like, you have to find the right person and settle down, and when you're gonna get married. Yeah, I'm sure we all know someone like that. So she, her younger sister gets engaged, and her mom tells her, like, you have to have a +1 or a date to bring to the wedding. So she tries to find someone to bring with her and tries to date in kind of all the normal ways, and it all sort of fails miserably on her. And then she basically decides she's just going to take matters into her own hands and build a date. So since she's a robotics engineer and she makes these very advanced, realistic humanoid robots, she builds Ethan, who's like her perfect robotic man. And he's handsome and he's charming, and he has Google in his brain, so he's very intelligent and all this stuff. And she actually manages to pass him off as her boyfriend, and everybody believes it. But then the more time she spends with him, she's almost forgetting that he's a robot, and she kind of starts to fall in love with him after a certain point. And so she has to get rid of him, but she doesn't want to, and she's kind of pulled between these two different things. So that's what the story is about.
How many pages is this novel?
I think the published version is maybe around 300. It was, I think, word count was about 80,000 or so, I believe.
Quite a big one.
Yeah.
And to think it was written, you did it as a comedy, right? Humorous.
Yeah.
That's interesting for a serious topic, like.
Well, and I think, like, there are so many stories out there, obviously, about robots and AI and that sort of thing, and a lot of them come at it from a more serious angle and that kind of dark, like.
Call it as also as science fiction? No.
Well, technically it is science fiction, but I would say that it reads more like a romantic comedy. It's not kind of hard, like Orson Scott Card, Dune type science fiction. It's more of a romantic comedy with sci-fi.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, thank you.
So usually what happens with any type of fiction is that we go through like phases of research, right? We go online or we take books and we read them. But usually for romantic comedies, the research is overlooked. People who write romantic comedy also go through their own set of research, but it doesn't come out like it does in historical fiction or like in science fiction. So because yours, it runs around robotics, and it has AI and all involved. How much of research in that did you have to go through? And if you had to go through research, how long did that research phase, go on for you?
I did do a fair amount of research for this. You're right in that romantic comedy is obviously generally it's much more just kind of character based. You might not have to do as much research. And I've written more sort of straightforward rom-coms like that, which don't really require much research. For this one, in order to kind of make the science aspects more believable, even though it's very much fiction and it's not, we don't obviously really have robots yet that can pass as a human and go undetected, but I still wanted to do some research to make the science feel somewhat plausible and to kind of get into the minds of robotics engineers and how they work and that sort of thing. So I did, a lot of it was through Google, first stop for everything, obviously, reading articles online and that sort of thing. I also did some interviews with robotics engineers and product designers to talk about not just the mechanics of the work that they do, but also sort of how they approach their jobs and how they think about it, and how do they work as a team with their coworkers, how do they think about like the end consumer when they're developing these advanced products, that sort of thing. Also talking about kind of the ethics and philosophy around AI, which I think is really fascinating. There's this one woman who I interviewed who's a robotics engineer, kind of like Kelly, in that she makes these very like advanced humanoid robots. And her name is Suzanne Gilder, and she, if you're interested in AI at all, I recommend Googling her and looking up like some of her lecture videos and stuff, because she talks a lot about the philosophy of AI and the kind of ethical conundrums and that sort of thing, which is really fascinating. And that's something that even over the course of the time that I've worked on this project, like I think if I were to start this today and start writing it now, I would probably approach some of that stuff differently than I did at the time, because my thinking about it has changed the more that I've learned. I think our general cultural conversation around some of this stuff has changed too. There are a lot of fascinating questions about, you know, if a robot or an AI entity of some sort has a certain level of intelligence, do they have some sort of free will? What kind of rights do they have? There's a robot named Sophia who's technically, I think, a citizen in Turkey, so who, you know, has like political free will and power in that sense. So a lot of that is very interesting to me. I think in terms of like how I actually did the research and how long it took, it was more of a rolling process for me. Like I did some in the initial phases when I was first writing. And as I went along, as I was writing, I would discover new things I needed to research, and then I would stop and do a little bit more research and get the opportunity to talk to a certain person. So then I would do an interview and that sort of thing. So it's not something where I think some writers might do like all the research up front. I tend to kind of do some up front, but then get into the writing, and that's how I find out what research I need to do as I go, which also helps me avoid the temptation of just researching for ages and never actually getting around to the writing, which I think sometimes writers get down that rabbit hole.
I mean, talking of research, how does a research for a fiction differ from the research for screenwriting?
I think obviously the essential basics of it are the same. You know, you're still trying to find out the facts that you need to know, and also just familiarize yourself with the world that you're writing about, so that you kind of feel like you're living in it. But you do have to do, I think, a different level of research for writing a novel versus a screenplay. In a screenplay, in a way, there's a lot less that you're doing and that you're responsible for as the writer, because it's such a collaborative process. You know, if you're writing a novel, the author is really kind of the one driving force behind it. There might be editors and people who are giving notes along the way, and other people who are involved, but it's much more like the singular work and vision of one writer. Whereas with screenwriting, you know, if you actually sell a screenplay and get a movie produced, first of all, you're probably not going to be the only writer. There are usually multiple writers brought in to do different drafts. And then even once there's a finished screenplay, there are hundreds of other people involved from start to finish in making a movie. So it's not just your work and your voice. And I think that's something that as a screenwriter, you have to be kind of cognizant of, is knowing what your role is and what other people's roles are, and not to kind of step over those. Like, for instance, you don't want to put too much direction in for the actors about like what the characters are going to be doing at different points, and every little gesture, how they're saying a line. Like, you want to communicate what you need to in order to make the story clear, but you don't want to step on the actors' toes and tell them what to do. So in that way, with research, you don't have to do quite as much for a screenplay. Like, for instance, with costumes, if I were writing a period piece as a novel, I would want to do enough research that I could really describe exactly what people are wearing and give that kind of vivid picture to the reader. But for a screenplay, I wrote a historical drama period piece recently, and so for that I did enough research just that I could kind of picture what the characters might be wearing and get a sense for myself of like how they might feel in their clothes, how they might feel in, you know, different types of weather, different times of year, how it would affect things that they're doing day to day. but none of that actually made it onto the page because I'm not describing what the characters are wearing. Like there's a wardrobe department and that's their job and I don't want to tell them what to do. So the research is a little bit less detailed, I think, for screenwriting.
When was this book published and how well was it received? Can you share something about?
Yeah, so it was published 2019, summer 2019. And I mean, I guess it's hard to say how well a book is received. I think it did decently well.
You can say, you can tell us about the review part or even, reader to writer, one-to-one interactions. Did you have any?
Yeah, I still get people reaching out to me on social media or emailing me through the contact form on my website, things like that, to say that they read the book and they liked it, and that's always so nice to hear. It makes you you hear from a reader. And so I've gotten some great feedback like that. I honestly don't really look at reviews. I looked at some early on. I know of like the professional kind of trade reviews. So I guess the big three are like Booklist, Kirkus, and Publishers Weekly. And I know from Booklist they gave it a starred review, which is really nice. So they definitely liked it. And then between Kirkus and Publishers Weekly, there was one that was positive and one that was not so positive. I don't remember which was which actually at this point. But the only thing I remember is that it was annoying because if you look, and I actually don't even know if it's still like this, but like if you look the book up on Barnes & Noble or different websites, like the negative review was always the one that displayed first, and it would hide the positive ones. And so I'm like, okay, well that's a great way to advertise it, but what can you do? So
I know, I can understand.
Yeah, I don't pay that much attention to reviews. I think from the ones that I've seen, some of it is people will actually tag me and stuff, like on Instagram especially is a very active place. I think.
Book discussions or such meetings in your place.
Yeah,
you did.
Yeah, I've done like book club appearances. I've done readings at bookshops and things like that. I did kind of a run of those, like a small book tour when the book first came out, and then since then I've also just had other opportunities here and there to do speaking appearances and that sort of thing to promote it. So even though I'm a couple of years out from it now, I'm still doing stuff to promote the book here and there. So it's definitely like a rolling process, I think.
Any particular reason why you left screenwriting and you moved?
Well, I haven't actually left it. I'm still doing screenwriting.
You're still okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm developing projects. I did. I left Los Angeles, so I was out there. And then
you left.
My husband. Yeah, we had to move for schooling, so that was kind of why I moved away. Okay. But luckily I had been able to sort of establish a network of contacts out there and get some experience, which is helpful. So I think for screenwriting, if you're just kind of picking it up cold and you've never actually worked in that industry and you've never lived in LA, it's really tough to get a foot in the door.
Yes.
So it helps to at least live out there for a while and meet people.
So how do you connect with other authors, and has that helped you in any way in your writing? Impact in your work?
For sure. I think other authors are a huge part of my work and my life as a writer, honestly. I think getting feedback and getting that kind of constructive criticism is really helpful for me. I always, as I'm going through and I do different drafts of things, I will give them to writer friends and ask for their feedback, and that makes a big difference to me and really influences what I write.
Yes, we all.
Sorry, hold on one second. Let me get my dog. Sorry about that. So yeah, I'm in a number of writers groups. Some of them are critique groups where we trade feedback on writing. I have one where we do writing prompts, which is a great way to kind of get together and just be creative and think about things that you wouldn't normally think about and write things that I wouldn't normally write. I'm involved in some writers organizations, like there's a local one called the Charlotte Writers Club. There's the Women's National Book Association. Those are great for kind of like speaker events and networking and that sort of thing. And I think that, you know, writers they're kind of each other's best support system. Like writing is such a solitary thing, or it can be if you want it to be. It's just you putting your thoughts onto the page or onto the computer screen or whatever it is. And so it's helpful to kind of get outside of your own head and talk to other people about it and bounce around ideas and get their thoughts and just commiserate sometimes, you know, with someone else who understands how the process can be stressful and that sort of thing.
We all have our set of first readers. And so we know what you mean. So it helps us, right? Even before it goes out into the world, you know, from us directly into the world, we have someone who can really, as a writer, as a reader, right? So Danya has been my first reader for my first book as well. And that's how we connected. The manuscript connected us. So that's an interesting story we have. Yes. Otherwise, we didn't know each other. So before that. So, and
I mean, even a lot of my best friends are writers, the people I've met through the writing community. So it's a great way to meet like-minded people too.
Yes, it very much is. And because you've had a background with screenplay writing, did that help you in networking for marketing your book? And are you thinking of adopting this, like, you know, making an adaptation of your book into a screenplay?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if it actually really helped that much in terms of networking for the book, because in a lot of ways, the film world and the publishing world are pretty separate. So I didn't really know anyone in publishing when I started out. So it didn't necessarily, I think it helped me with some writing skills and some ideas of like how to market my work and how to pitch it and that sort of thing, because that's something that screenwriters really kind of get trained on. But it didn't really cross over in terms of the people that I knew. As far as adapting it, it has actually been optioned for television. So there's a production company that has the rights to it right now, and they're developing it for TV, which is exciting, but it also, the way these things work, I mean, the majority of books that get optioned don't actually get turned into TV shows or movies. So I know that chances are it's not actually going to make it on screen, but it's still just nice that they're interested and that they're working on it. I've thought at different points about maybe just writing a screenplay of it myself, just on spec, and adapting it that way. And maybe someday that's something that I would do. But at this point, I kind of feel like I told that story and I've moved on from it mentally, if that makes sense. Like I have other stories that I've written since then, and other things that I'm working on now that I kind of feel more invested in. And I think I would need maybe more time away from it to come back and feel that creatively excited about like picking up again.
And what are you working on? Any other book? Next book?
Yeah, I have a book that I've been working on that I'm gradually getting notes from readers on in one of my writers groups. It's another romantic comedy. I have another idea for a book that's percolating that's very, very much in the early stages, but I'm kind of excited about it. And I've been also focusing on some screenwriting projects as well. Lately, I've got a feature that's in development with a production company and a new pilot that I've been working on. So I'm one of those writers who likes to work on multiple things at once. So I've always kind of got different projects going.
Oh, lovely. That's nice. So how has social media helped you in, as an author, and how do you think it can be useful also for your book? I mean, aspiring authors out there will be, getting help from your answer. If you can share with us. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I think social media it's a tremendously helpful resource. Obviously, it's a free way that you can get out there and market your work. It's a little bit of a kind of mixed blessing, I think. I have sort of a love-hate relationship with it, and I hear a lot of writers articulate the same thing. I think that it can be really helpful, but it can also be a time suck. Like I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and between those three platforms, just trying to maintain an account and keep someone on top of notifications on all three of them and post somewhat regularly feels like a lot. And I always feel like I'm behind and I'm not doing enough. So I think that you have to sort of balance being active on social media and knowing what works for you versus still also leaving time to actually write somewhere in there. And
it can really swallow your time.
Yeah,
If you're
yeah,
not balancing it. Yeah, I know what
exactly.
it is. So
I would say so Instagram is one that I got on at the advice of my agent, and I found that to be probably the most helpful for writers, at least of those three. There's a really active community of readers and writers on there, and that's the place where I most often get readers reaching out to me. So if you're going to choose one as an author, that's probably a good one to go with.
so how was the fellowship experience, and how did it help you as an author or a debut author? Or was it before the book or after the book, first of all?
Well, I did a fellowship with the Blacklist, like a seminar that I did with them several years ago. So that was before the book. Okay. And that was a screenwriting event. So it wasn't really directly related to the book in any way, but it certainly helped me as a writer. I think I learned from that experience and got some good feedback on a script that I was working on at the time. One sort of anecdote that I'll relate from that I think was helpful, bigger picture to me as a writer, was we had a few different screenwriters who were there kind of as our like mentors for the time that we were there. And they both are very successful screenwriters, and they both had very similar paths that they talked about when they were talking about kind of their history as writers. They both started their careers by writing a spec script, meaning something that was just an idea they had that they were writing on their own and just kind of pitching out there. And those scripts sold in like major deals and kind of launched their careers and got them a lot of attention. And at that point, they were both getting a lot of assignments and writing kind of other people's ideas and other people's work. And things were going along, they were working and it was fine, but they were sort of getting into a rut and losing kind of the passion for it, and they weren't doing quite as well. And they both, after a certain number of years, decided again to write another spec script, just a passion project that was their idea, that they didn't know if it was ever going to sell.
How long was it? How long was it? And where was it?
So the fellowship was, it was about 3 days, I think, and it took place in San Francisco. It's an organization that's run out of Los Angeles, but they do some of these kind of labs in other cities as well.
Okay.
So because we spoke about this fellowship and stuff. I mean, all this when authors get together and we have like conversations, or we go to like the events where we meet like-minded people, there'll be one thing that you will always have that fear of your idea being plagiarized, right? There will always be that fear, and especially if it's a screenplay, there's a huge opportunity and a huge risk for your work to be stolen or plagiarized. How have you handled that?
For me, maybe I'm naive about it, but it's honestly not something that I worry that much about. I know it's a possibility, and it certainly has happened, but I think that the likelihood that someone's going to steal your idea in reality is pretty low. I've worked with writers who are very, very conscious about that. I remember I did a short several years ago with a guy who was kind of paranoid about it, to the extent that we had to use like this crazy encryption system to like email each other stuff back and forth. And I was like, we're making a short for no money that not many people are going to see. Like realistically, nobody's hacking our email. But I think there are protections you can take, like you can register a script. I don't know if there's the same thing for books, but for a script, I think you can register it with the WGA, maybe get a copyright on it. So I think also just obviously keeping your drafts is helpful, so that you have a record of what you wrote and when, and that way if an issue does come up, you have proof of, this was my idea and I wrote it on this date. But in my experience, in reality, I don't think that's that much of an issue. I think as long as you're being somewhat careful about who you share your work with, you'll probably be fine.
I don't think so. So
I hope so, at least.
Should we go out? Should we log off, and should I send you the request now? Yeah, I think that's better.
Yeah, that works.
Yeah, Sarah, because you talked about going to an agent, how does it work? Like, because in India, and I'm sure most Asian countries, what they have, that the agent culture, the literary agent culture is a little nascent. It is there, but it is not like a necessity that we will have to go through an agent. We can still very directly to the publishing houses. And what happens when there is no agent or a middleman is that we wouldn't know if our work was rejected or if where all our work goes. We'll just be sending it to random people, right? So it will be like a very, it will basically be like an arranged marriage where you will have to make sure that you are finding out everything about the other party and finding to adopt to it. So how was your experience through the literary agent, and how is, like, were there rejections? Were you made aware of the rejections of your work?
Yeah, in the US, I think it's much more that you do kind of need to have an agent if you want to be traditionally published. I think there are some smaller publishing houses where you can write to them directly and query them directly as a writer, but certainly the bigger ones, you really have to have an agent in order to get in the door. So once I got my agent, she sent the book out on submission, and I was really not involved in that process at all. She basically just took it, and she didn't tell me where she was sending it or who was saying yes or no. I'm sure there were rejections, but I didn't really hear about them along the way. I think that might vary by the agent. Like I know I have one writer friend who her agent has a spreadsheet that she shares with her where she'll show her everything, all the people that she's sending the book to and what their response is. So it might just depend on your agent. For me, I wasn't really involved. I didn't really hear what was going on until I heard that there was a yes. So in some ways, that's kind of nice that you're not hearing all the rejection, because I'm sure that it's happening.
Yes, it definitely is nice when you're not hearing it. You'll at least stay motivated to keep writing.
Exactly. Yeah.
So how was it, Sarah, to hold the first copy of your book in your hand? And normally, which one you like, as in seeing your name in the screenplay that you wrote, or this as a book, physical form of what you individually did it, and you. So how was it?
It's an amazing feeling to hold, your first book for the first time and just have that, because writing is such a sort of ephemeral process. It's just these ideas, and then to have it turn into something that's actually tangible and real and that someone else can pick up and read and do something with is really amazing. So that was very rewarding, I think, and especially because as a screenwriter with that kind of background, there's really no end game as much for most of the things that you're writing as a screenwriter. Like you can't get a screenplay made into a movie or a TV show on your own unless you're very wealthy and can afford to just fund the whole thing yourself. You need the backing of people in Hollywood to fund it and to make it. So especially when you're early in your career as a screenwriter, you're really just writing things and kind of throwing them out there and trying to get anyone to read them who will read them, but that they're not going to actually probably turn into movies. So to write a book and to know that, in my case, I was lucky to get it traditionally published, but even to know that self-publishing is an option, that was something that really was motivating for me as I was writing, that if I want to publish this and make it a book and get it out there, like I have that opportunity on my own, which I think is a really great thing that authors can do that as well.
When you're really particular about publishing your book traditionally, or did it just happen on its own, or where you no, I'm not going to spend money on myself on my own book? Was it like a principle that you had that you'll have to follow?
Yeah, I honestly didn't think I was going to get traditionally published. I thought it would be, because I know it's competitive. So I thought I'll write this and I'll make some attempt at traditional publishing, but it's probably not going to work. And so then I was very much open to the idea of self-publishing, and I probably would have pursued that. But I guess I got lucky and I did manage to get an agent and the book did sell. So I was able to get traditionally published, and I'm grateful for that experience. But I think that self-publishing is a great option too. And I know lots of people who do that. So if I did it, I don't know if I would have been willing to spend a lot of money on it, just because that's just who I am. The thought of spending all that money on marketing and stuff.
I know.
But
so the world is becoming so visual, right, Sarah? Yeah, Netflix and OTT, and it's all, how do you think that is going to affect the readership, the physical book or at least people should read Kindle book, right? At least digital book. So how do you think is the future of books as it is? And has your book come in Kindle?
Yeah, mine, it's also available in Kindle and ebook form and in audiobook form. I think on one hand, it's great that we have audiobooks and ebooks as well. I think anything we can do to make books more accessible to more people and encourage more people to read whatever form that takes for them is great. And I feel like there are a lot of people who really only listen to audiobooks. So the fact that they can do that and consume books while they're driving or on the treadmill or whatever it is they're doing is awesome that we have that these days. But I think there's always going to be a market for print books as well. People are doing such beautiful and inventive work with book covers these days that books are like these little works of art, you know, and I think a lot of people, they like that you can have a library in your home and bookshelf with these beautiful tangible objects. And also just because we're all on screens all the time. Like I'm always on my computer. So it's nice to give my eyes a rest sometimes and be able to just look at the page instead. So I think there's always going to be a market for print books as well. At least I hope. I prefer them.
I just
How did you do your video, your audiobook? Can we know about getting audiobook? How is it done in your, I mean, we don't know much about it. In fact, I don't know anything about it. How did you do your audiobook?
Well, for me, the publisher really did it. I wasn't that involved. They sent me samples of 2 different narrators that they were considering and asked if I had a preference. And I picked one of them and she did a great job. I haven't actually listened to the whole audiobook. I've heard like a little snippet of it, but she actually won, I think the audiobook won an award for that format. So I'm sure that she did a wonderful job with it. So I don't know much about getting an audiobook produced because I wasn't really involved in that, but I did hear someone talk recently about like AI audiobooks, actually kind of relevant to this topic. Like you can have just basically a program or a machine that reads it off as opposed to hiring a human narrator, which is obviously cheaper.
I get to see many like Pico Iyer and many travelogue writers as well as fiction writers. They are writing their own book in their voice. That is also a trend. Didn't you think of that?
I didn't, partially just because the publisher never asked, but I also don't feel like, I don't know, I write for a reason. Like I like to be behind the screen and like just writing things on the page. I don't think I'm an actor or narrator or any of those things. So I'm happy to let a professional handle that and I'll stick to the writing.
I would do that also if my book gets, because I don't like my voice. Anyways.
I just have one question and after that we can go to World of W. The last question that I want to ask you is that did your plot pick the genre or had you decided already that I'm going to do romantic fiction and then make your plot revolve around the genre?
I think in this case, it was definitely plot first. I just had the idea for the story and I really didn't think as I was writing it about the genre or the audience or any of that. And also because I had no experience in the book world at that point, I really didn't even know that much about like what the genres are within the book world. Like if I were writing this as a screenplay, I would call it a comedy, but there's no comedy section in a bookstore, you know, that they're humor books, but those tend to be like nonfiction, kind of funny essays type of stuff. So it ended up getting published as contemporary romance, but that was something where there were kind of other genres that are in play as well that it could potentially have been classed as. You could call it women's fiction or kind of general commercial fiction. Technically, you could call it sci-fi. So that was basically the publisher decided what section to put it in based on the buy numbers from the bookstores. I think now that I've had that experience, I'm a little bit more conscious of genre and of making those choices when I'm writing something and of knowing like where it's going to end up and what audience I'm going towards. But when I was writing it, I was just kind of writing the story and then figured that part out later.
So yeah,
okay,
now
I will only ask a simple one. Just came in my mind. Sarah, according to you, what really is creativity?
That's a big question. I guess Creativity, I would say, is doing something new. It can feel a lot of times in this world like everything's been done, that whole like there's nothing new under the sun idea. As a writer, sometimes it can feel like any idea you have, like there's some version of it out there. I mean, even with this story, there's a German movie that I haven't seen, but a friend mentioned it to me recently and was like, oh, this sounds like your book, like a movie that came out in the past few months, which has a very similar storyline, I think. But I think you have to remember that as a writer, like you're not just providing the basic idea or the basic world, you're providing your take on it, and how you write something and the way that you view it is always going to be colored by your individual lens, and to embrace that and not try to write someone else's story or someone else's version of your story, but to know that that's like the one thing that you have as a writer is your individual point of view, and nobody else has that. So I think just use that and really harness that creativity.
Thank you. So now we go to
now we
world
can
of W.
we can move on to World of W. World of W is nothing but a set of W questions like what, when, where, and all that. And it's for the listener to, if they did not have the time to listen and sit through the entire session, they could scroll down here and get a gist of it. The first question is, what is your next book about?
Well, the book that I've been working on, which may or may not be my next book that actually comes out, it's another romantic comedy, and it's a little bit darker in terms of subject matter. It has to do with some mental health issues, and it's about this girl in small town North Carolina who's like an aspiring stand-up comedian, but she's basically stuck and held back in her career because of certain things that are going on in her life. And then this guy moves there from New York for the summer, and they build a relationship, but they both have sort of secrets that they're keeping that kind of unspool over the course of the summer. They find out about each other. So that's the one that I've been working on most recently.
When can we expect this book out?
Oh, that's what I want to know.
roughly for the readers.
I'm in sort of a transition place, so honestly, I'm not even sure if I'm going to try to publish this one, or I might switch to a new genre. But who knows? If I do publish it, then I'll be posting about it. You'll know.
Why only romantic fiction? Are you really comfortable there, or do you not want to branch out? Why just stick to one genre?
Well, I actually would love to branch out, and I've written things in many other genres. This is just the first book that I got published, and a lot of the screenplays I've written too have been in that genre. But as a reader and as a writer, I love reading and writing and watching all sorts of different things. I wish that I could just write whatever I wanted and not have to worry about genre or branding, but there is definitely a tendency as a writer to kind of get pigeonholed into one area and to feel like you have to stick to a brand. So that's one of the things I've been kind of grappling with at this point in my career is, do I want to kind of change directions and pivot? Because romance was not an area that I ever actually set out to go into. I kind of got directed into that through a series of circumstances. But I do love romantic comedy, so it's a space that I'm comfortable in, but I do love also writing other things.
Okay. So where can readers find your books?
It's available basically anywhere that you would find books: independent bookstores, bookshop.org, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. My website is saraharcherwrites.com, and there are links to buy the book on there. There are links to my social media, so that's kind of an easy place to find it.
Okay.
So, how can our audience reach out to you, like through Instagram, through Facebook, or email? Which one are you comfortable getting queries from? How can
any of those channels, really. I'm pretty accessible. So you can go to my website, saraharcherwrites.com. There is a contact form on there that you can use to send an email. Also on social media, I'm on Facebook. I can, my handles are different on every website, so it's a little complicated, but Facebook is Archer Sarah P, Twitter is Sarah Archer M, and Instagram is Sarah Archer Writes. But also if you just go to my website, saraharcherwrites.com, I think there are links on there to my different social media pages. So, and I try to check my messages. I don't always get to them right away, but I'm always happy to hear from readers and to talk to people.
So, what would you like to tell aspiring authors, and how did you feel about the session?
Well, this has been wonderful. I always love talking about books and hearing people's ideas about literature and that sort of thing. As far as what I would tell aspiring writers, I guess, read and write as much as possible. That's always good advice, but also really, use your other writers as a resource, like we were talking about earlier. Getting notes from people is hugely helpful, and do the same thing in return. Be a resource for your fellow writers, give them notes, support their work, go to their events, that sort of thing. Like there's a great writers community out there. And now with the internet, it's more accessible than ever. You can do events from all over the world. So take advantage of that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm just stopping.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Sarah.
This has been wonderful.